maybe one day bring it down.
Sorry, everybody, I just remembered to press record. So
Okay.
we've just finished our introductions.
So yeah, that's living wage for families. And then Colin, I think I was going to talk through kind of the next kind of general theory about the living wage and kind of explaining for those who don't know what the living wage is, if you want to move on to the next. Slides. So what is the living wage? It's a bare bones budget that kind of helps families and individuals be able to meet basic essentials and pay for things like food and rent and childcare and those kind of basic essentials, to have an acceptable quality of life, like a nice having to work one full-time job and being able to pay for the basics. But it isn't, it does not include things like paying off debt. It doesn't include things like savings for retirement. And as you're going to learn through some of the presentation, a lot of the figures that we're using, although we're taking them from reputable data sources and we're really proud of the figures we're using, we're often using the lowest cost possible to kind of reflect that this is the minimum that you need to be able to earn to be able to make ends meet. Next slide. So the living wage at the moment is calculated using a family of 4 with 2 parents, 2 children. The parents, the children being 4 years old and 7 years old, so having to access both the different kinds of childcare that are available. But we also this year, for the first time, did kind of draft calculations for what the living wage would be for both a single person without children and a single parent family. The living wage, depending on where in BC, and we haven't yet kind of, the living wage came out to be reasonably comparable for that for a single person without children. Now that's partly because it's 1 income rather than 2, and although kids are really, really expensive and we're not sending them out to work, the living wage family gets a lot of money in government benefits that helps offset some of the costs of having children. That single people without children are missing out on quite a lot of the government investments that have come in recent years to try and address and tackle poverty. But the living wage is not sufficient to help that and to cover that of a single parent with 1 child. So that's just kind of something to bear in mind. So where does the kind of the idea of a living wage come from, or why are we why do we think it's such an important thing? For me, the reason I'm so passionate about living wage is it takes an issue as big and as complicated and as scary as poverty and breaks it down into something that's relatively achievable or something to do. And there's different roles that we can all play in kind of helping to address poverty within our communities. The first reason why living wage is transformative is it can make an enormous difference on the lives of low wage workers. So across BC, over 2,000 workers last year got a pay increase because their living wage employer brought them up to the new living wage, which for some workers, that was an extra $1,000 or so in their pockets that they didn't have. It also makes employers part of the solution. As I said, it takes something like poverty and it offers solutions for government. It offers solutions for employers. It offers solutions for consumers on how we can kind of address that. It helps change how we value public services. So things like, for example, investments in childcare, not only do they benefit families with children, but then it can help lower the living wage, which makes it easier for employers to pay a living wage. And you'll see when we talk about the living wage budget, there's various different things that governments can do to help kind of address all of the things that are going into it. It helps boost the local economy. Researchers found that when low-wage workers get a pay increase, they are far more likely to spend that money and spend that money locally than when high-wage workers get a pay increase. High-wage workers may choose to invest it, put it into their pension, go on an international vacation, whereas low-wage workers may treat themselves to a haircut or a meal out in a local restaurant, all of which is pumping more money back into that local economy and helping keep money locally and keeping things going. And then the final reason is it helps shift the way that employers and all of us view low-wage workers. And I think that's something that first began to happen during the pandemic was the role done by workers like cleaners and security guards and retail workers. Suddenly, instead of it being seen as a job that anyone can do, actually there was real value, rightly so, on the important work that they're doing and the important need that those workers need to be earning enough to be able to pay for rent and food and other essentials. And the final reason why it can be transformative is it means that people like this man in this photo they have more time to spend with their families. They don't have to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet, and instead they can work 1 job and be able to spend their weekends or their additional days off with their family. Next slide. So yeah, we at Living Wage for Families, we calculate what the living wage is for communities across the province. So we come up with the kind of framework and the methodology, and then we partner with groups like the CBT to help gather some of those local costs. And here you can see this is a map of all of the living wages across BC. And you can see that they range from $20.66 in the Fraser Valley all the way up to $26.51 in Clayoquot Sound. So I'm really sorry. I don't know if sorry is the right word, but you have the highest living wage in the province. We'll come into why that is in a minute, but I think it's really interesting to look at that. And I want to also acknowledge that it is a real challenge for employers who want to be paying a living wage. They want to be doing the right thing, but when you have one of the highest living wages in the province, that can make it a real challenge. The main differentiator, or the main thing that drives that big variation in living wage rates, is housing and the cost of housing. And then the other thing is often transit. Transit can be the second biggest thing that really makes a difference and where it is. Food is a really interesting one. It's much more expensive to get food on Vancouver Island than it is in the Fraser Valley. I'd say that plays a slight role in that big differential between the two, but the main thing is housing. And so if we can address the housing crisis, that helps bring the living wage down, or at least stop it rising at the rate that it is, which makes it easier for employers to pay a living wage, which hopefully means that more workers in BC can be earning a living wage. On to Colin to share it very much from the local perspective.
All right. So the living wage, and we're calling it the Clayoquot Sound living wage, but it's obviously the whole stretch of coast accessed by Highway 4. So our sort of catchment area is the same as the CBT area of service. That's including Clayoquot, Hitatsu, Iqaluit, Tofino, the Cloquet communities, Sowista, Taistanis, Opitsit, obviously Ahousaht, Hot Springs Cove. So it's a really diverse area. The experience for people and the realities of living is really diverse as well. And obviously there's a ton of disparity, socioeconomic disparity, geographic disparity, that kind of bring together the factors that go into the calculation here. And just to verify, or to clarify some things, I didn't fully understand this when I was starting to work on the calculation this year. What goes into the living wage? So the way the living wage is calculated right now, it does not include, for example, it does not assume employer paid benefits. And things like employer paid benefits, things like paid sick leave, Pro D opportunities, health and dental, that kind of thing, can all help offset the living wage that you would need to pay an employee in order to kind of meet the criteria. So that's a big factor. And then you can see also the other things in this infographic on the right-hand side. These are sort of the elements of your hypothetical, family budget. And it's interesting for me too, even I'm just like at a stage of life where I'm finally starting to make my first family budget and really breaking down the costs of living. And, it's different too. Everybody's personal finances are different, but I've just found it's really struck home with me as I start to think about, what the costs are. And, I am like the stereotypical family here. Like we've got two kids. But at the same time, I've got to recognize I got a really privileged situation, and like working at the CBT, they're able to really do kind of the model living wage employer, and that's clearly not the case with all employers in the region. I mean, it doesn't account for the volatility of the hospitality and tourism economy, that kind of thing. So yeah, these are kind of the conversations I hope we can get into after we break down the cost. So the West Coast living wage, the graphic on the left-hand side is just, kind of shocking to see it go from 21.25 to 26.51. I think and that was over, just a 3-year period, kind of going from mid-pandemic to post-pandemic chapter. And this is part of the living wage or the vital signs research program that we do. So part of vital signs includes aggregating data over time so that we can see trends and see how the trends intersect with other things. So one thing I want to point out here before we dive into it is that actually between 2017 and 2019, you can see that the wage went from 2011 down to 1963. And that was directly a result of some new childcare policies put in place by the government. While at the same time, we weren't seeing through the roof inflation, and housing costs during that time were relatively stable. Um, but we have now seen in the last couple of years the things that Anastasia mentioned are the single biggest determinants of the living wage, which are housing, cost of transportation, cost of food, that kind of thing, increase a lot. So I'll take our attention over to the right-hand side of this, which is our, back of the napkin, or in this case, spirally notebook infographic of the family budget here. So I'm going to just walk through the actual individual line items. So the cost of food here, this is a very conservative estimate of the monthly cost of eating for a family four. It's calculated actually by the CDC, and it's published in a food costing report that is biennial, and it's updated for inflation each year. So it's a really robust measure for the central region of Vancouver Island. So I want to also point out that it includes Nanaimo, Parksville, and Port Alberni. Most of the people on this webinar would know that it's cheaper to drive across island and get your groceries at No Frills than it is on the coast. But there's an added cost, obviously, of your gas and your travel time. Um, and yeah, some of the statistics that we know from our own research here is food costs are up to like 12% higher on the West Coast here, just because of the logistical reality of trucking it over the mountains to get it here, and things like storage, and especially if you get further out from where the co-ops are. If you go out to um, any of the remote communities, it's a real eye opener what food is costing in these places. Um, so yeah, the conservative estimate, but definitely robust. You can see that's up 33%, and that's largely just inflation as we see. The clothing is also kind of a standardized cost generated by Statistics Canada's market basket measure, which is geographically, it's a nationally, it's obviously Statistics Canada, but it is geographically tweaked to reflect the cost of living in this region. And it's more sensitive than other poverty measures because, yeah, it does account for the geographical difference in the cost of goods. Housing, this is a big one, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this for obvious reasons. So one of the things that we do at CBT is troll the rental Facebook groups for Euclid and Tofino, and just keep an inventory. It's kind of sometimes it's a bit depressing for me because I'm just like constantly seeing so many epic people looking for housing. I also feel like it's a bit invasive. It's such a small community, and I get to see like, oh, this person's looking for housing, this person's looking for housing. But these, I think, are the human sides. It kind of humanizes it for me. It makes it more than just data because I'm actually able to see, real people doing real important work in the community, and kind of the reality that is the housing shuffle out here. And it's not new. Most people who live out here are pretty familiar with it. So one of the things I want to point out is the housing. It also includes tenants, insurance, and utilities. And this data here was actually drawn from a relatively recent Tofino housing needs assessment. So that is Tofino specific data, which is a little bit higher than the rest of the region, but it's also a few years old, and we skewed it up a little bit for inflation. Um, it's not the data that I just told you about, which is the stuff that I pull from the local Facebook groups, because the actual average rent that I was getting from the Facebook groups would have had the three-bedroom coming in at just under $3,000, not including utilities and insurance and all of that. Um, and when we plug that data into the spreadsheet, it was actually going to make the living wage spit out at over $28 an hour. And that's actually, that would just be really untenable for a lot of reasons. And one of the things I want to point out there is that the data that I'm getting from the Facebook groups is the rent as it is right now. And I've noticed and the Tofino housing needs assessment included leases that were not just, the current year. They included leases that were, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. And what we're seeing, not surprisingly, is that if you signed a lease, back in 2019, your $1,200 bachelor suite that you're still paying 1,200 for now. If that was to get re-rented out, that would be, significantly higher. So it's definitely a lot of variability in the housing cost, and things that can smooth that out, like Anastasia mentioned, are more public funded housing projects. And we're starting to see also like legislation. I'm not going to name any, but there's obviously a lot of interesting developments going on in the regional housing scene right now. And also thing I want to also point out is that the 3-bedroom house is really not, there's not a lot of 3-bedroom housing rentals being advertised out here. So the actual calculation methodology, it's a little bit tricky to plug that in, because the number of 3-bedroom houses actually for rent on the market is really slim. So moving on, the cell phone and internet, that's pretty standard. That's just super economical house or cell phone and internet plans for your house, 2 adult cell phones and home internet. The transport, this is another big one where I'm going to spend some time talking about it. Look at that number. It's up 129%. Well, gas has gotten more expensive, but it's not that much more expensive. What's going on there? So the previous living wage calculation only included the cost of owning and operating one car, according to Statistics Canada's market basket measure framework. And it was assuming the provincial calculation assumes that the second parent could take public transit to work. And so that was just a externality in the previous calculation. And the provincial framework actually changed the way the calculation worked this year and determined that if there is no public transit, the reality is workers are going to need to drive to work in a rural and remote place, especially if you live in one of the outlying communities where there's just not the same job opportunities in the community. You have to drive to Euclid or Tofino to do this. So yeah, the figure is doubled, basically the 100% increase plus the 20%, 29% increase that would be inflationary. And I just want to also even put out another anecdote here. Like we had a coworker at CBT who is living in Taistanis, and she didn't have her license or vehicle. And it's hard to encapsulate this kind of information into the calculation, but for ride sharing, and you can thumb it, you can hitch, but that's sketchy and difficult, hard to get to work on time. And there are informal networks of ride sharing, but this sort of going rate is $20 to $25 one way to pay for a ride into town. And that would also be kind of similar with the taxi services, or Whistle when that was operating. So it's definitely hard. You can't like factor that in because it's kind of anecdotal, but it's just to say the cost of transport is real, and the cost of transport for the most marginalized or like lower income is super significant. And I feel like as a person like of more privilege, I hadn't really thought about this as directly until I started looking into it. So yeah, that's transit. Childcare is another really interesting one. Anybody who's got young kids in the area and doesn't particularly have like local family to help support with childcare, or sort of informal networks of childcare support, has to dive into the wacky world of finding childcare. And there's definitely been an overall lack. Lots of families are finding solutions with private nannies and that kind of thing, but the calculation here is based off of publicly administered or publicly subsidized government, I guess what you want to say, registered childcare programs. And like housing, there's a real variability in what individual families are paying depending on what kind of subsidies their daycare facility has and what kind of subsidies their family has, because there's a few different subsidies. So this factor here, 387, is kind of an amalgamation of a bunch of different subsidy programs and researching the actual costs that the daycare providers are charging in the area. And you can see it is down 32% because there is overall an increase in subsidizing for the childcare systems. And yeah, I think there's a lot of positive development in that front. It may not feel like childcare is getting more affordable to all families, but the data is suggesting that it is. Non-MSP health costs. So this is the portion of health costs that are not covered by MSP. But it is stuff that could be covered by employer benefits. Obviously, there's differences in how much copay benefit models cover. Some employer benefits may still cover almost all of those non-MSP costs. Other ones may cover 80%. It depends on the benefit plan, but this is definitely increased significantly too, just because of the way that health insurance is increasing premiums. It's also changing because of the actual overall cost of healthcare, services and products. 48% is a pretty significant percent, but overall, it's not a huge chunk of the budget. The contingency fund is just representing savings for unexpected expenses like caring for a sick relative. It's based on 2 weeks of pay for both the parents. At the living wage, the parents' education, that we just took based off the cost of 2 courses at North Island College, but it could represent, any type of ongoing career-related, maintenance of licenses or certifications, trainings, that kind of thing. And that is relatively the same. Like that hasn't gone up in price because North Island College is a standardized rate, I suppose. And then the last bit is everything else. So other expenses, that includes stuff, just living, maybe going camping, maybe your Netflix subscription, going to, check out the aquarium, get your family aquarium pass for the year, birthday parties, haircuts. And that increase is largely just inflationary. So that is our breakdown of the living wage. Um, so this is just a overview, no surprises. Anastasia's already kind of mentioned the single biggest determinants of the living wage are actually kind of government, somewhat, the government can do a little bit about it. So investing in more affordable housing opportunities and policy changes to do with housing. Yeah, transit for our calculation this year, like if we get public transit initiated between now and the next time, that will definitely decrease that line item in the budget calculation. So we're definitely going to see that. And that's obviously a very governmental um, realm where the impact can be seen. Expanding low cost childcare. Again, we're seeing a lot of positive developments on the coast for that. So that's exciting. And direct cash transfers. These are, I guess, maybe Anastasia can clarify, but I think these are generally like rebates and that kind of thing.
These are things like the Canada Child Benefit, the BC
Gotcha.
Child Opportunity Benefit, the renters rebate that's just happened. A lot of those direct cash transfers have increased a lot in the past few years, which is where we saw that decrease in the living wage in 2018. Where I think we also need to look at is how can we increase those direct cash transfers to families without children, people without children, because a lot of those direct cash transfers have rightly been targeted at families with kids, and now the biggest group of people in poverty is single people without children. So is there more money that can go to that way to help those people?
Yeah, actually, just on that note, I remember Iglika, Anastasia's coworker, who's an economist, was telling the story of the initiation of the living wage many years ago. And at the time, the public frameworks, families were really getting hard hit. And yeah, I think she mentioned, Anastasia, that now that has shifted, especially through the pandemic, where the way costs of living have gone and the impacts on individuals. Families have a lot of support relative to what was happening in the past, and individuals are increasingly having to pay higher costs, especially if you're not like living in a partnership, if you're rolling solo.
Which is why the living wage is it's pretty much the same if you're a single person without children than if you're in a two-parent, two-child household, which is
Mhm.
interesting.
All right. Yeah, so businesses, obviously, paying a living wage is a thing that the Living Wage campaign encourages businesses to do. Anastasia's already talked about the number of living wage employers in BC. But we also do know that it's really hard to pay a living wage in the place that has the highest living wage, and also in a place that has such a relatively one-dimensional economy that's quite boom and bust, like we saw last summer with the road closing. That impacted sectors all across. Not just the food, but my friend drives a tow truck, and she's like, yeah, my work dried up as a tow truck driver because most locals aren't getting their cars stuck, or like they have friends who can help them out. And I never thought about that. um Anyways, yeah. So yeah, employers can work out how many staff are not earning a living wage. In fact, just doing some back of the napkin stuff, like looking at what benefit packages you offer. And it's possible that with the benefit packages, you might actually be bringing them up to the living wage already without even knowing it.
And we have a calculator on our website to help work out the value of your benefits. But the main things you want to be looking at is health and dental plans, additional paid time off beyond the statutory minimum, and then any like education and training. They're the three main things that kind of can go into lowering the living wage.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think we can just skip ahead now to our living wage employers. I don't know if we have our Saltwater Building Co. here on the call yet, so I might just give him a call and see if he's around, but we can start with Maddie. Thanks for joining us, Maddie.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Colin and Anastasia and the CBT for creating, the space for this conversation and doing the work for myself and my partner, Kate, to be a living wage employer. And it's really nice to see so many familiar faces and for those of you that don't know, my name is Maddie Grayson. I am the owner of Tokidoki. We're a Japanese street food spot here in Tofino, and I'm calling from unceded Clayoquot First Nations territory. So yes, we are a living wage employer. And first I wanted to say, I think each business is so situational on the feasibility in the current economy on whether it's doable to be a living wage employer. The odds are unbelievably stacked against us right now, especially for the smaller businesses. But I've been asked to kind of speak a little bit on Kay and I's story and why we're a living wage employer and how we're able to have that feasible for us, and also how I'll speak on how the increase from the previous calculation from 21 to 2560, 2650, one is how we were able to make that change feasible. So a little bit about Kay and I. It may be boring and simple, but to be honest, when we made the decision of starting the process of opening a business in 2022, it was an early conversation that we agreed upon that if we were going to do it, we were going to do it right in our minds. And what that meant to us was paying a living wage, providing benefits, provide incentives, and foster as healthy of a work environment that we're able to provide and that we know how to. And when we built our business plan around those values, and it ended up at the end of writing that business plan, if we weren't able to provide a living wage based on our calculations of starting our business, then we weren't going to start the business. And, I know that's not how everyone may go about their business plan, but it didn't make sense to us to start something that wasn't sustainable for our employees to be at. So I would say that the reason for us wanting to do things a little different, or however you want to frame that, is absolutely attribute as well to the amazing experience that we've had as employees in Tofino. I can't speak for Kay, but I can say that I've been mentored by some of the strongest women possible. And because of the impact they've made on me as an employee, it fostered all this, and it fostered us wanting to be a living wage employer. I can say that one of those people, Samantha's in the call today. She was one of my first bosses in town coming back from university. And not being a living wage employer, and it's not a poor reflection, obviously, in whatsoever to new business owners and who are starting businesses. But I do, to be honest, in my personal opinion, think it is slightly a poor reflection in how we're educated on starting a business. From either taking business classes to going to the government websites on how to start a business to, Google, which is how most of us figure out how to start a business. The first thing you see pop up is not how to cost your business based on living wage and paying that to your employees. It's how to cost your business at the lowest cost possible, which, yes, makes sense in some ways, but also it doesn't make things very sustainable in the long term. And so I think that the reason why we've been so successful in being able to continue to be a living wage employer is even with the massive increases in the past few years, the core that we started with, that hasn't changed. And so the whole other part of this is because the wage did increase $5 in the past few years, how do we sustain that? And to be honest, with the change in wage, so did our job description and job titles, is basically how we went about it. We had to make a really hard decision this winter on how we were going to go about increasing these wages to work within our business model. And to do so, we stopped thinking of ourselves as an entry-level position, even though we in the outer world we're a food truck and most people would see that as, you know, an entry-level job. And because we stopped thinking of ourselves as entry level, so did everyone else. You know, the going wage for an entry-level line cook globally is not $26.51 an hour. So we stopped considering our jobs as entry level and we started hiring this spring with persons with experience in the industry rather than training people from the kitchen from the ground up. Shifting our mindset on the value that we're able to provide as employers has completely opened up a massive pool of professionals that have experience, understand our values, and are looking for long-term sustainable work in the community. And I'm really proud in a town of it being very hard to find employees. A lot of the time, this past month, we've had 40 applicants for one position. And 80% of those people have been long-term community members with more experience than Kay and I combined. So, you know, it's really given us a really, I guess, sigh of relief that others understand what we're trying to do and people are ready for a change in the industry. As a small business, it's really easy to undervalue yourself and what you offer. And once we took ourselves seriously, people started to as well. And I guess the last thing I'll touch on is the struggles that we've encountered. Because it has been really hard. It definitely was a punch to the gut when Anastasia, we got her email saying that the wage was increasing. And I have to say as well, it is a lot easier for us. We're an extremely small team. So, you know, we aren't paying 30, 40 staff where there's 4 of us now in our company. And in the summer, we normally reach to about 10 people. But with these wage increases, our staff we definitely won't have as many positions available. And we are changing all the job descriptions. But I'd say the struggles that we mainly encounter are, you know, the obvious. Of course, the cost of everything is so high. Just yesterday, I was doing my monthly recost of foods and goods, and the cost of cabbage, which is one of the main ingredients we use, went up 36% per pound in the last 2 months. So we really, really understand how difficult and how hard this can be for businesses to make it shift. And you know, we try really hard to make our dining option affordable in town with everything on our menu under $20. But with increases like that, it sometimes does 100% feel impossible. You know, the other part of this that I haven't really spoken on before, and I'm hoping that maybe this is a good platform to maybe hear what other people think, because I hope that us as business owners, in my mind, we're doing the right thing and we feel really passionate about being a living wage employer. But I do have to say the other really hard part about being in the position we are in is the negative feedback that we've received from other business owners in town. We received a lot of backlash for the fact that we are and they're choosing not to be, and there's no judgment on our side. We understand that everyone is in a completely different position. And a large part of that, you know, because of the backlash we received when we first opened specifically, we have like made a conscious decision to not speak publicly about being a living wage employer too often, other than when we're hiring. You know, in the past 2 years, I've only made one public post about being a living wage employer, because it is really common that we end up getting emails or texts or messages back about the fact that we aren't making the right choice and we're making it really hard for everyone else. And that obviously is no one's intentions. But that has been a really hard part, you know, being in a small town and knowing all the business owners in town and feeling as though that you're doing something that could be damaging someone else when that's never your intentions. So and that's kind of where we are at and why we're doing it and why it's hard. But at the end of the day, we've been able to navigate a route to be a profitable business and sustain a living wage and support our staff the best we can. I will have to say, I may have to run out of the call a little early. I do have to go to work, but I'll try to stay on as long as I can. But thank you again for including me in today's call.
Thank you very much, Maddie. That's so compelling. Maddie also told me, "Oh, I'm not a great speaker. I'm not." Thank you. That was so clear and professional, and yeah, just well said. And some really compelling stories there. And yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought about not sharing the story. This is a safe space, hopefully, to share being a living wage employer. I guess we've had Chris join us from Saltwater Construction. But in the interest of Maddie having to go, does anybody have any quick questions for Maddie or things they wanted to share? Okay. Right. Well, I think we'll
I just
just
want to say thank you. Thank you for sharing and being so eloquent. And I'm sorry that you received a backlash. Maybe we can talk separately about any ways that we can help overcome that, because yeah, we hope that living wage is a positive thing and never supposed to be we also never want living wage to be a shameful thing for those that don't pay a living wage. We never want to kind of point fingers and expose those people who aren't, but more use it as an opportunity to lift up and elevate those that are, what we feel, doing the right thing and paying a living wage. So thank you for doing that, and for sharing all the struggles you have. In fact, last year we lost pretty much every single bar one food employer that was based in kind of food and selling and making food, because they had both their wage costs increase but also all of their food costs increase. Like the cabbage example is a really interesting, it's poignant to how cabbage is more expensive for the consumers and for the workers, and it's also very expensive for you as a business. And unfortunately that's something that we're seeing everywhere.
Well, thank you. And I should say as well, like, with the negative feedback, there has been obviously so much positive feedback as well. And we have had so many other business owners reach out to us as well, saying that they have been inspired to reach out to you, Anastasia, and reach out to the program. So, there always is obviously that balancing act.
So I realized, I had a couple questions, if that's okay. Is there time for it? Okay, great. Maddie, hi. Hi. Nice to see you. Thank you so much for sharing. That was really eye-opening and very helpful. And I really like what you said about no longer thinking about your wages as entry level. I was also wondering, are tips involved in the wage? I haven't looked at your job posting, so I don't know do you start everyone at the living wage, and then there's tips
so tips are obviously optional. I also personally, as someone who's in the restaurant industry, thinks tips are on the way out, and hopefully with everyone that is, one day, hopefully everyone in BC is a living wage employer, tips will no longer exist. Oh, sorry, I think my computer froze. Am I still there? Okay. So I think that tips will one day, not be existence in Canada or in BC. I think, we're still far ways away from that. But yeah, our living wage is not calculated including tips. The only calculation that does go into our living wage is we provide full medical benefits to our staff. But besides that, the tips aren't included.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
I had a question. Oh, I have a question. I'll put on my video. Hey, Maddie. I was wondering if in future calculations, the living wage goes down. Do you have a plan for that, for starting wages at a lower level than they are now, or would they always be pegged to, just how would that work for you?
It's hard to say at the moment, depending on like where things will go with our current economy. I personally think, and it'd be interesting to hear what Tours and Tofino or the other accommodation providers in town think. But I personally think this year is going to be a quieter year in Tofino, and then we may see busier years coming in the future. But if living wage were to go down, it would give us wiggle room to start hiring entry-level positions again at a lesser wage, and then work towards moving them up to the same wage as everyone else. It would give us the ability to have some flexibility in being able to give raises. Right now, we're pretty much capped, and it'd be really hard to give a larger wage increase to people who are moving up within the company. And that's how partially we were able to go from the 21 to where we are now is the people that we had working with us, we promoted them. And within the promotion, they then had a wage increase. And they now are making well over a living wage because everyone else will be starting at a living wage. So we're hoping that if the wage increase were to go down, it would give us more room to and have people come in with no experience, and then we can train them to these different levels of wages that we've created now.
Thanks, appreciate that.
And we never, when the living wage did go down, we never said cut the pay of the current staff, but instead freeze it, and then anyone new, exactly what Maddie said. So anyone new can come on at the lower living wage, and then it also allows an opportunity to kind of breathe for a year before the next living wage increase.
Awesome. All right. Well, we've got about 10 minutes, a little more than 10 minutes here. So Chris has joined the call. Interested to hear the opinion from the construction sector, or this experience. Chris, if you can hear us, feel free to share.
Yeah, I can definitely hear you. Sorry, full apologies for being so late here. I got stuck on a boat that didn't make it to pick me up from one of our remote projects this morning. So hopefully you can hear me. I'm just trying to get into a Wi-Fi spot here that's about 100 meters further up the road.
Yeah, we got you loud and clear.
Oh, awesome. So yeah, we own a construction company. From a living wage standpoint, it truly wasn't that hard to get there. The majority of our senior staff, anyone at a journey person level, are significantly above the living wage as a starting point. Most carpenters, electricians, plumbers that are ticketed, or sort of above first, really as long as you're above a first year apprentice, you're kind of, the local market is putting you into that $25 to $30 an hour wage. And then once you get into ticketed level, higher level of apprentices, you start pushing high 30s into low to mid 40s. And then management is more into like 6-figure salary based positions. So it wasn't a huge stretch for us to do it. It affected sort of our bottom end a little bit, but not by much. So in that regard, it wasn't a big deal. I think for us, it's more just highlighting that the construction sector, really for us, we kind of did it as like a challenge to the rest of the sector to be like, get your stuff together if you're not doing it already. So that's really where we kind of came from. I do think like as an industry, especially in like the local market here, with where interest rates have gone, where construction costs have gone, we're bumping into a lot more like issues where people are, like putting projects off or just saying like, hey, it's just not financially viable. So despite the fact that, like our salaries and wages are pretty solid, it's becoming exponentially more tricky to continue workflow, I would say. So in the future, it's possible that, again, on that lower end, it might become a bit more of an issue as far as like maintaining that. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at as a business and as kind of an industry, I guess. Yeah. Open to any questions or anything.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. Maybe what was you said that you wanted to be a bit more of an activist in your sector, and that was the main motivation so how did you come to know about living wage and make that decision as a company?
So a previous employer of mine had gone down this road a while ago. And it was always something that my wife and I, like, we've strived for for this since we started our company was like, it's the people that matter, and you know, they need to be looked after, and the idea of having any business where you know, you knowingly are employing people and but not providing a functional wage for them that allows them to actually exist in a proper manner is just completely unappealing to us. Like I cannot imagine doing that actually. So there is like an element of kind of like our own activism. We're like very large housing activists. I'd say 50% of my day is spent working on like housing problems more than anything. And so we, you know, we're aware of what it costs to live here and all of that. So yeah, you know, a little bit of an activist role within our industry, but more just kind of highlighting what it actually takes to be here from a bit of a not really marketing standpoint, but from like a client communication standpoint. It's actually really been beneficial to have like solid data about what living wages are in the area and like what actual costs of living here are. Because a lot of our clientele are actually not from here. And they're like, why does it cost as much or more to build in Ucluelet and, you know, as Vancouver? You're like, well, actually it costs more to live here. So that's been kind of like a bit of a silver or like a bit of an unintentional benefit to us, is just being able to have sort of the information that living wage has provided is sort of in justifying what construction costs are at the moment.
That's great. Yeah, that's awesome. I have like a couple of slides here that came from Anastasia's organization, and I think what Maddie and Chris have just said has kind of substantiated a lot of these infographics here. It's really interesting. And it's so cool to hear from, I feel like, yeah, the hospitality and tourism and then construction are kind of the main economic drivers in the area right now. Does anybody have any other questions or thoughts they would like to add here?
I just have a couple questions. What is the process for Maddie and for Chris as far as becoming a living wage employer? Is it a sign up type system, or is it just self-declared?
So I can answer that one. So there's a really simple form on our website, and in fact I can drop it into the chat and we can follow up via email, where you fill in the form for small businesses of less than 50 staff. The hard bit is making sure that everyone is earning a living wage and doing that work that Maddie was saying about business plans and stuff like that. But once you're there, the process to become a living wage employer, we want it to be as easy as possible. So I will just drop in the chat right now the form to complete to become a living wage employer, and then we review them once a month, and then we get back to everyone, and either we'll say, oh, we have a question about this, or we certify you, and then we can send you some decals and some plaques, like in the picture here, to kind of promote to the world that you're a living wage employer.
Because I think one of the things that Chris had mentioned was that for a lot of businesses, they are already paying a living wage, you know, like Chris's business for his employees already, you know, having to be at that level. It wasn't a matter of changing anything. And I think there are a lot of businesses on the West Coast that are living wage employers that just aren't designated or identified, and aren't talking about it, which then, to Maddie's point about being one of the businesses that talks about it, that then everybody else is like, well, you know, that's hurting my business. It's like, well, maybe actually majority of the businesses are living wage employers, but just aren't able to talk about it. We have a unique staff accommodation on the West Coast, makes our living wage very different for some employers that are getting subsidizing housing. And so they actually might be paying a living wage because the housing is subsidized. And so there's, you know, ways that they can actually be registered as a living wage employer, even though they're not paying that very specific wage because of all the other aspects. Anyways, Anastasia, we haven't met. I'm the new executive director with the Tofino Long Beach Chamber of Commerce. And so it would just be something I would like to, help if businesses need some of that support, communication, to be able to become a living wage employer sort of more officially, because I think there are so many that actually already are. And if that's something that is important, to be communicating for them, helping them with those tools. And so whether it's maybe through CBT is a member of the chamber, so maybe it's communication through them, or I'm not sure if living wage organization it becomes a member, then I can, sort of facilitate and maybe do some separate help and training for businesses on the West Coast to become certified.
Absolutely. And we'd be happy to give a similar presentation to any businesses through the chamber if that's something that would be useful or beneficial. And you're right, there will be quite a few that are already there. They just may not be aware of it. And we want to be able to promote them, because then that helps inspire others. Because the more we've seen that a lot of our growth, the number of living wage employers, is less about the work that we do, but more when a business gets certified with us, they're proud about it, they shout about it, they promote it. And then a lot of the others in their sector are either like, hey, I'm already there, I can get that designation too, or oh, I'm not quite there, but I can do now, and it helps inspire. And that's where we've seen real growth in the program over the past couple of years, is that kind of like employers inspiring other employers to do it. So happy to have that conversation with the chamber to promote it within the businesses already in the region.
Like from a business standpoint, I can say it wasn't particularly challenging to go through. It probably took 3 or 4 administrative hours total to go there. Like, we filled the paperwork out, it got sent off. There was a little bit of an audit review with a few questions, and yeah, generally it was a pretty straightforward, easy process. So like, if anybody's like using that as an excuse as far as like not to do it, I think that would be disappointing, because it's administratively, it was very straightforward.
I was wondering, are the graphics that were shown earlier, are those available on the like Living Wage for Families website?
So some of them are, and have a look, and also on our social media pages. The one that we haven't publicly shared yet, but there's no reason why we can't, is the Clayoquot budget one, which I think is the really interesting one, of seeing that budget change. We haven't, that one we only made a couple of days ago, but we can share that with anyone if anyone does want to use it for whatever reasons.
Yeah, and like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we're not doing like a published report specific to the living wage this year, just because we also just did vital signs and we want to have it on an alternating year schedule. But it is a big change, and there is a lot of buzz being, circulated. So I think I'll update it on the CBT website. I'll put a recording of this presentation and I think, yeah, a version of that back of the napkin line item budget. So yeah, we'll make sure there's
proper rigid, like, we haven't just pulled these numbers out of anywhere. They're based on rigid reports and things that are already had, and actually good methodology.
Yeah, sorry, I'm putting it as I'm just referencing the actual like graphic design of it being in like a little notebook. You know what I mean? It is a very robust calculation.
Exactly. But yeah, we can also share them with anyone who would like them.
I also have another question, kind of about like what the excuses that a lot of employers use to not, or to like even just pay minimum wage. And I've often heard like, why some employers don't agree with the like minimum wage or raising it, because the excuse is that the cost of food and services and everything will go up. So basically it does nothing. And what would be a good response to that, or like kind of a way to address that? Because I get that a lot when trying to ask kind of businesses about that.
Sure. I think there's 2 things. I think it's worth acknowledging that if we were to make the living wage now $26 an hour, that would be a real challenge for a lot of businesses. But in terms of when the minimum wage goes up, and it only goes up by the rate of inflation, so it's almost for workers, it's giving them a lagging pay increase of the costs that have already been faced and incurred by everyone. It is a difficult time right now for small businesses, and I acknowledge that. The vast majority of workers who are earning minimum wage are working for large multinational companies. And so these are companies that can afford those increases. The minimum wage has increased it's increased a lot over the past 5-6 years, and we haven't seen a change in unemployment rates reflecting that. Often we hear, well, if the minimum wage goes up, I'll have to fire my workers and then they won't have any job. And the data doesn't back that up either. So that's the kind of the main things we also say. And then the other thing is that slide, which I think Colin skipped over, is the business benefits for paying a living wage, that I think Chris and Maddie articulated much better than I can, in terms of being able to kind of invest back in. And when you lose a staff member, it costs you a lot of money to hire, retrain, and get them back up. Whereas actually, if you can pay them a wage so that they don't want to go anywhere else because they know they're earning a living wage and they know they're doing well, actually that makes business sense as well as moral sense.
Okay, yeah, I was just I should have clarified. Yeah, this is just in response to basically my dad works as a manager for I'd say it's a pretty large company that works with food services in Metro Vancouver, and so I always try to tell him about that, and so it's more of on a bigger business, but that's always the response that I get from him specifically. So.
And I think that I've yet to see any evidence on minimum wage increases lead to further inflation. It's kind of like the minimum wage is going up because inflation is going up, and it's kind of a lagging thing rather than leading to more inflation. And the reason that housing prices and food prices have gone up is because, well, housing prices, there's not enough available housing, so we need to build more affordable housing and make more out there. With food prices, it's an interesting parallel. Food prices around the world have gone up because of the war in Ukraine, because of supply chain issues since COVID. And also at the same time in Canada, those grocery stores are making record profits while their food is getting more expensive. So there's definitely some things in there. Whereas there's less evidence to be like the reason that food prices have gone up is because the retail workers who are working in those grocery stores got a 2% pay increase in line with inflation.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I had another question, and I was just thinking about what Maddie was saying about the entry-level wages. And do you have any living wage employers that hire like high school students? And I guess, and how to manage, like, is there, because they're living at home, that their cost of living is very different, and they're learning so much on the job. Do you have any businesses?
Yeah, we don't.
Is there allowance for that?
Yeah, we don't say that it's okay to have two different rates depending on, because there's a lot of reasons why that high school student, there's a lot of reasons to break down. One, you don't know what's going on in that high school student's family. So they may be living at home with their parents, but it might be that one of their parents is unable to work, and so they're the ones that are kind of having to work to be able to put in and pay for rent and things like that. They may be living at home and not wanting to live at home for much more longer. Equally, the other side of it is in the UK, where they have different minimum wages based on age. And so I think under 21s, their minimum wage is a lot lower than over 21s. It leads to some employers choosing to try and hire students and younger people over older people because it's cheaper labor. And we wouldn't want to inadvertently say it's okay, like don't hire anyone over the age of 25 because they're more expensive. In the same way, actually, when we're looking at changing the methodology for the living wage to kind of take into account different family types and what is the living wage for a single person and a single parent, we want to be really careful with the way we manage that communication, so that when there's only one living wage that we're talking about, but we're not inadvertently saying hire these people, they're cheaper, don't hire single parents because they're more expensive, because that is not the kind of the thing we want to get across. With specific regards to kind of high school students and co-op placements and stuff like that, we have a few exemptions. You can be a certified living wage employer, and if you've got a student doing a co-op placement or doing something as part of Canada Summer Jobs, and it's a specific kind of scheme, so long as they don't make up more than 10% of your workforce, they can be exempt from the living wage requirements. And also, if you have someone and you're hiring them for less than 120 hours a year, then they can also be exempt from the living wage requirements. So if you've got a high school student that then is working more than 120 hours a year for you, they're the same. They should be the same as any other worker.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. It's great information.
No worries.
I have a thing to add to that too. Interestingly, we had Canada Summer Jobs funding for some positions at CBT, and we definitely under budgeted for what we should have been paying them. Like Anastasia said, we weren't paying them $26 an hour. And we actually had trouble recruiting because a lot of the younger people who are going to be applying for these jobs could be making significantly more, even just like working in a kitchen at a restaurant in the summertime with tip out and stuff. So there's like a competitive incentive to actually be paying in this particular economy for sure.
I had a question.
I was just gonna
Sorry.
say, I know that high school students are the number one sought after group of workers around here because employers know that they have housing.
Oh yeah, I agree with that. We hire a lot. We have Canada Summer Jobs here at the Visitor Center, and I was actually just thinking about like how like managing if you have a high school student coming in at the living wage, and then you have someone who's been like just how you manage how those like the tiers of wages and I mean if we can definitely like pay more, but also just thinking about if you're like a smaller business.
Yeah,
how,
and I think
how to manage it.
Yeah,
or
and
how
when the
other
living
people have.
and when the living wage is as high as it is, and when there's a $9 gap between the minimum and the living wage, that makes that entry level job thing a lot harder and a lot harder to manage, which is where we want to focus a lot on affordability and how do we close that gap, because then suddenly a lot of those questions are not it's not as explicit on the budgets and harder to do because it can be a challenge. But interesting feedback about the fact that high school students are stable because they've got somewhere to live, so therefore they're not going to leave because they're suddenly going to be looking for somewhere to live and having to move out of town.
And they'll probably get a ride to work too and be showered.
I think we're over time. Jerry, you just made a really good point about nonprofits, and that's something which I want to look at. We're looking at living wages. How do we encourage when governments give grants and people give money to nonprofits that they're paying living wage jobs? Because nonprofits very much understand the importance of paying a living wage, but their challenges are less about trying to make the case for why they need to pay a living wage, but instead how do they do it given their tight budgets and things like that. And so we definitely want to work with government to try and encourage that any grants that they give to nonprofits, it's paying a living wage at least.
Yeah, and I mean, this is an advocacy tool like the living wage. You can write that into grant proposals and say, well, this is the money we need to do this work. And this is the reality. It's kind of like the nonprofit equivalent of pitching the construction costs to the Vancouver client. All right, well, I mean, if anybody has any other questions, feel free to chime in. I'll hang around here for a minute, but really appreciate the engaging convo. We've recorded it. There's definitely some threads I'm going to pick up on. Yeah, it's been a generative discussion, so thank you all.
Thank you for hosting.
Facilitating.
Great.
Thanks.
Hey, Colin, can I ask you a question?
You bet.
I was wondering if you have received any like negative feedback about the way the Clayoquot Sound living wage is calculated or communicated with that big basket of goods. It's like other items being like over $1,000. Obviously it's a living wage, it's not a minimum wage, but I just wonder what kind of comments you receive in pushback to the way it's calculated here. I love the explanation around housing. I had often wondered that myself about whether you were looking at rents as they are currently marketed or looking at previous leases like existing housing costs. And that's like such a good nuance to understand. But yeah, just wondering what you've received in terms of feedback.
Yeah, to be honest, haven't had too much negative pushback. Like what Maddie said was really kind of eye-opening to me, actually. I think, yeah, because it's actually a relatively conservative account of even like the food costs. Like the spreadsheet we put in for food is, or the numbers we put in for food are actually less than what if you were just eat purely at the co-op, because it's a mid-island measure.
Right.
Yeah, and likewise with the other category, that's sort of all the other social participation costs. Yeah, haven't had too much pushback. The way that's actually calculated is super boring. It's actually just 17% of the food and clothing costs.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's just meant to be like a discretionary budget that you would have, after all of your, food, rent, etc. is covered, to
Yeah.
have $1,000 to get your kid a birthday present or something like that, over the month.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I would like to do. We haven't done a super big living wage campaign since 2021. And
Mhm.
this year we're intentionally not doing a full-on campaign because we just did vital signs.
Mhm.
So yeah, like we haven't, I'd say the folks here are the kind of dialed in, preaching to the choir kind of demographic. So I think that if we did do a broader campaign, we might get a little bit more critical conversation going.
Yeah, I think the chamber, you would see a critical conversation. I think it'd be really useful too.
Yeah.
I think that's like such a great linkage.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, I mean, Maddie even like what Maddie said, I think is just indicative of the scene, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, so I do want to get that critical conversation going, obviously, but be tactful about it.
Yeah. And then my other question is, when would you recalculate? When's the next time we do it? Is it annual?
Well, technically, our plan is to do it biannually now. So we're going to do it again in the fall of this year.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah, to get back on our every 2-year rhythm, because we didn't do it since 2021, and then yeah,
And
that
by
way
then
we'll
we'll
have
have transit. And I think there are
yes.
some really big changes that will happen around here that hopefully make it I don't know, the wage that it's at right now is a really difficult one to communicate. And I don't envy your position if you have to go to the
Yeah.
Chamber of Commerce and talk about a $26 living wage. But if you can bring it down, I think it might be a more enjoyable conversation.
For sure. And I mean, I too think like having Sam engaged in that conversation, and she's pretty looped into the private sector scene. Like that's my one thing. I feel like I'm such a not private sector guy at this chapter. So, to show up in that room and be like, well, who are you? You don't have the credibility to talk about this, but to have sort of allies across the sectors is really key in having a good conversation.
Yeah. I love the points about being able to bring the wage down specific to the benefits you offer as well. I don't think that had been communicated to me before, that can influence the package, the total employment package that you offer. And I think that would resonate well to a lot of businesses they use the Chamber of Commerce to source like an employee benefit package for all of their businesses. Like they have small business benefit packages that they offer, and it would make the conversation more palatable. Again, just trying to think of that.
Time. It's like, what are the things that you're already doing? Housing is a big one. If you offer a subsidized staff accom, given how expensive market housing is, then that would, I think, and that's not actually, I don't think they have a way to do that from the provincial.
I wondered if they did. I don't think that would be contemplated. I didn't hear her speak to that, Anastasia.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's tricky, with anytime you have to have like a provincial framework applied to a unique local context, like as unique as this one, it's never perfect. Also, one thing we didn't talk about today is the sort of like transient nature of a lot of like the low skill, low wage, seasonal, like gap year type jobs.
Yeah.
I think that's one you would often hear from employers is like, well, they're just here for a summer and they're not that considered their priority isn't making a livelihood here and making, raising a family or whatever. But that's obviously not the intention of the living wage.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah, I really loved Anastasia's worker-centric perspective about not wanting to disadvantage other groups by providing different living wages for different types of people.
yes.
I thought that was illuminating and I loved it.
Oh yeah, she's bright. I really have enjoyed learning from her in this process. And Iglika, her coworker, is a like like an economist version of Anastasia. And she was
Amazing.
originally supposed to join for this, but she's yeah, she was busy. But anyways, there's just so much to think about in the conversation. Grateful to be having it.
Well, thanks. I'll go. Oh, I can see that Gary asked about transit. Yeah, April 2nd, buddy.
Yeah, it's coming.
Okay. Bye, Colin.
Bye, Elise. Thanks for coming today.
I just hopped back on because I was like, wait, there's probably going to be like some more interesting discussion.
Yeah,
I was able to. That was great. Thank you. I really.
Thank you. Yeah, that I'm definitely it's as good as the participation, and the conversation's been good. For sure. It was great to have Chris's perspective coming from the construction sector is that kind of surprised me a little bit. Kind of pretty blasé. Just like, oh yeah, well, it's like construction's a pretty like high skill, high pay industry, so it wasn't that hard. I think it's a different context for the trades than it is for hospitality and tourism.
Yeah, it was really good to hear both perspectives. And then also, yeah, I always love Samantha's take as well, and coming from the accommodation sector. And then, yeah, I was thinking about even just, the visitor center, like I'm like, how can we? That was really, that was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
And we do get a lot of questions. I think also like the big thing too is we get a lot of questions from industry, and now I feel like I can now I can answer them. So that very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're just developing our capacity to facilitate the convo too,
Terrific.
I wish Faye had been here because she's done this work for the last few years, and she's done a lot of like she did her master's in kind of like public health and poverty reduction, that kind of thing. So I know she would have had a lot to say, but I'm gonna show her the recording and kind of float a few of the ideas that have come to her. Did you ever meet Faye Missar?
I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, anyways.
Okay,
Clever
well,
individual who's thought a lot about this too.
yeah, terrific. Okay, well, maybe I'll scoot. I'm in our lunchroom, so I have a feeling some people might wanting
Right
to.
on.
There's kind of a scramble this morning for space, so
Yeah.
so I'm gonna scoot. But thank you so much.
It's a great Zoom background, the lunchroom.
Oh, thanks. Oh yeah. Perfect.
Good to see you.
Okay, nice to see you. Thank you.
Bye for now. All right, Jerry and Erica. I don't know if you're actually there, but probably gonna shut her down here. Get some lunch. Thank you for coming.